Good morning, I'm Waywornwyrm, and welcome to my channel. And welcome to episode 1 of Tales from Oberth, The Trip to Gernero. Hedwig Hohmann looked up from her book to check on her traveling companions. They had been in Kawald for almost a week now, and so far there had been no issue. She was hoping it would stay that way. They would be leaving tomorrow. They were so close to leaving. Landolf was easy to spot at always. At 6 feet and 2 inches tall, he was always either the tallest in the room or not far from it. And if that wasn't enough, he was a bull of a man. Currently, he was mixing with a group of mercenaries, drinking and laughing. She was sure they had a lot in common. Landolf used to be a man-at-arms after all. Her eyes continued scanning the room, this time for Karl Reichenbach, the other warrior in their little company. He was about as different from Landolf as one could get, while still being cut from pretty much the same cloth. He joined the group not too long ago in a small village called Zerachthrubb. His family were proud members of the local militia, and he had spent decades in said militia without much to show for it. His prized possession was a real sword. Not that Hedwig had ever seen him use it. In fact, she was not sure he knew how. His weapon of choice was just a normal woodsman's axe. He was sitting at the bar with a drink in hand, soaking in the ambiance. And in the end, Hedwig wasn't really worried about those two anyway. It was her other two companions that she worried about. There was Kai Schiedelmann, a man who was most often referred to as rat-like. Not that anyone could really place why that was the adjective that came to their mind for him. Kai did not have the facial features one generally associated with rats, although he was quite thin and frail looking. There was just something about him that came off a little greasy and oily that almost everyone seemed to be able to pick up on. If you were to ask Kai, he would tell you that he was from an old noble family who had tragically fallen on hard times during his teenage years, and that's why he had turned to bauble selling. A story that Hedwig would have found hard to believe if she didn't know how much coin Kai had, especially the number of gold crowns he had. All in all, it was more believable to her that a man like him could have come from an old family than he had gained more money than she had ever seen in her entire life put together by selling the junk he tried to sell wherever he could. Although it didn't seem like he was up to anything that problematic tonight, as he was tucked away in the corner of the room, people watching, which is one of his favorite pastimes. She found what she was looking for in her last companion, however. Alberta Bear, a charlatan she and Landolf had picked up early in their travels together, was putting on this act that she had magic abilities that she was showing by correctly guessing which card was about to be flipped from a deck of cards over and over again. She was pretty convincing as a hag when she wanted to be. If you didn't look too close, you could mistake the acne scars on her face as pockmarks, and her silver hair and gray eyes, paired with her slender build, made sure she was able to sell the entire act fairly well if Hedwig was being honest. Of course, Hedwig strongly disapproved of that particular act. Not that lodging these complaints had ever held water with Alberta. As an Empire official sanctioned diabolist, Hedwig was very careful and touchy on the issue of magic. Especially the public flaunting of one's magic, even if it was just an act. Hedwig had spent years at the academy learning the precise ways to pluck at the ether and weave magic. And she was all too aware of what happened when people plucked at the ether and instead tore a small hole in the veil. She herself had never personally met an Inquisitor, and she hoped to go the entirety of her life with that still being true. The witch hunters were brutal, to say the least, and when they came to town to hold a full inquisition, there will be witches found, even if none actually existed in the town before the start of the Inquisition. She shivered at the thought, and at the unbidden memory of Roland, after he had accidentally ripped that tiny tear in the veil and let some of the abyss escape. She had almost recognized him afterward. With the tingles still lingering in her back, she closed her book and went upstairs to the common room they were staying in. Tomorrow would be a long trek, and so would the rest of the week for that matter. And she wanted to be sure that she was rested before they left. They were headed to a hamlet called Gernero, apparently run by a priest of the King of Winter named Harry. The local small chapter of the King of Winter here in Kawald had told her that Harry had reported to them that there was some sort of trouble in Gernero. Trouble that required a ragtag group of adventurers like the group she had. Technically, they were mercenaries. But when there are only 5 people and they mostly solve problems for hire rather than join any of a number of battlefields, they generally fell into the subcategory of adventurer. Luckily, Alberta managed to complete her act without creating too much attention or messing up. No one left thinking she was some type of heretic. Ultimately, she failed in her goal, as she was unable to make any coin from it. But maybe she'd be back someday and could leverage it into something. She wasn't sure what that something would be, but it was something to remember and store in the back of her mind. Alberta made her way into the common room not too long after Hedwig went to bed, and went to bed herself. The rest of the group made their way into the common room at various points in the night, in various states of drunkenness. The next morning, when they gathered to set out, paying their bill at the inn they had been staying at, the morning was cold but clear. The trip would take them through the farmland surrounding Kawald and some grassland past that, but then into the forest along the road to Gernero. It would be just under a week, and by the end of it, almost all their rations would be consumed. Though, there was a fairly high chance that this journey would be quite profitable. And that reason alone, is why they had decided to head to Gernero, a town that they knew almost nothing about. Looking back later on the trip from Kawald to Gernero, Hedwig would call it misery. On the first day, a few hours into the trip, a downpour started that lasted throughout the day. As night set in and temperatures dropped, the downpour turned to snow and a late blizzard began. Carl tried as hard as he could to get a good fire going, and he actually started praising the snow as it began to fall. Apparently, at least according to him, it was easier to start a fire while it was snowing than when it was raining. Hedwig didn't see that it made any difference, as he still failed to get a fire going at all that night, and they slept huddled together under what little cover they could find. Sometime late during the night, the snow stopped, and was replaced by a strong wind that lasted the rest of the night and into the next morning as they set out. The best thing about the wind was it caused the temperature to rise out of dangerous and into a range that would have been comfortable if they were not soaked to the bone and in winds strong enough that the trees creaked and threatened to break as they entered the forest. Eventually, the wind calmed down to a nice breeze around the time they stopped for their midday meal. As they stopped for the evening, the rain resumed, and although it was steady, it was not the downpour of the day before. It was cold overnight, but not cold like the night before had been. Even better, now that they were in the woods, Carl was able to start a fire that they were able to keep going throughout the night. On the third day of travel, the rain ended around midday, and that night, Carl was able to make another fire, and they were able to dry their clothes for the first time since the downpour started on day 1. The fourth day was actually rather pleasant, but it was the single day of pleasant travel in an otherwise horrible trip. Which means it was not a great day, and the mist that rose up in the forest around midday and lasted until very late that night when a downpour started again did nothing to raise spirits. The fifth day was their final day of travel, and it was the worst of them all, even counting the blizzard. Rain pelted them nonstop all day long, and between the forest canopy and the dark, menacing clouds overhead, the spirits were very, very low. One thing of note happened when a very thin man, who had been clearly tarred and feathered, ran up the path making a lot of noise. The party had no desire to deal with him, however, and they hid in the undergrowth and behind trees as he ran past. Because that they were not anywhere near him, they were never sure if he was clucking or if he was screaming about a mob or something behind him. If it had been a mob, it had dispersed sometime before, and they didn't meet it. Near the end of the day, they entered a large cleared area where several miles of land had been cleared, and as soon as they walked through clear farmland, they saw a wall with smoke from chimneys sitting in the middle of the cleared space. Standing in front of the gate to the town were 2 men in leather armor and shields with makeshift spears. "Halt! Who are you and what brings you to town?" one of the men shouted as the group was still some ways off. Hedwig stepped forward. "I am Hedwig," she began and gestured back to the others, "and these are my traveling companions. We come from Kawald, where the priests of the King of Winter told us your leader Harry needed some help with some problem. We are what you would probably call adventurers." The 2 men looked at each other and had a short, quiet conversation before looking back to the group. "Very well, you can enter. We're about to close up the gates for the night, so we'll escort you to the Cracked Cup, where you can get something to eat and rest your head for a night. Someone will inform Harry. You'll be summoned to him tomorrow." Thank you so much for listening to the first episode of Tales from Oberth. Make sure to tune in tomorrow, where we have the next episode of The Pugilist.